project to reduce marine plastics in the region. And as today's title suggests, we are going to learn about how bridging the gap between the informal and formal sectors can transform waste management challenges into opportunities for inclusive urban development. So, our speaker today will draw on real world experiences from India, Indonesia, Hong Kong, China, and Sri Lanka to highlight practical solutions, including innovative collection methods, effective procurement strategies, mapping initiatives, and technologies that are there to enhance efficiency, environmental sustainability, and livelihood outcomes. Our speaker is Siddharth Hande. He is currently the CEO and founder of the Kabadiwalla Connect, and you're going to hear more about this social enterprise in a bit. And Siddharth's work focuses on developing scalable and inclusive solutions for the collection, aggregation, and processing of post-consumer waste in cities in the developing world. He aims to articulate a more cost-effective and inclusive approach for cities in the global south to apply circular economy principles by leveraging the informal waste ecosystem. I'm sure you will have a lot of questions because there's a lot of interest especially in the informal waste sector and how we can bridge this gap with the formal waste sector. So if you have any questions, you can drop them in the chat. I will be taking note of them. Or later on, if you feel like your question needs more context, you can raise your hand and unmute yourselves. But for now, let's turn our attention to Siddharth. Siddharth, over to you.
Thanks, Anna. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, ADB, for this platform to speak about the work that we do. While I'm just pulling up my slides, I noticed there's close to 50 people in the chat, so as participating. So if you could just drop your name, location, and maybe what aspect of the waste management ecosystem you come from, that would be really helpful to me. Just good to know who's in the room, so we can dive down into certain topics. I'm planning to, let me just get my screen up first. Okay. All right, folks. So let me see if I can check what's happening in the chat. Is that a chat? Yeah, folks, if you can just drop your name, where you're coming from, that would really help me also dive into specific topics. So request you put your name, organization, interest in waste management, or experience in waste management. As simple as waste collection or recycling or whatever it may be. Cool. I'll come back to it, but in the meantime, let me start. So hi everyone, my name is Sid. I run a company called Kabadiwalla Connect. We are a for-profit social enterprise that helps integrate the informal supply chain into formal systems. I'm a data scientist by training, so worked in the development sector for a number of years. My entry point into founding Kabadiwalla Connect and working commercially in this, running a social enterprise in this space, comes from mapping this informal supply chain. So I'm a data scientist by training, GIS, remote sensing. So really, while I was working in the development sector, I was looking to apply for grants to actually map aggregators, informal aggregators. I was very interested in building this ecosystem understanding of informality and quantify the volumes, the impact that they're having in cities in the global south, mainly starting with my hometown in Chennai. Chennai is the 6th largest city in India. We're on we're in the south of India on the East Coast. And so I have 2 points of departure that is really important to set the context about the work we do. The first is that waste collection systems in the global south, they're extremely expensive to the municipality, and they're quite inefficient. Just the act of collecting all the material and sending it to the landfill is is quite costly to the municipality and doesn't work quite effectively. There's a lot of leakages happening, contributing to marine litter, ocean-bound plastic, a lot of dumping happening in the city. So you have a formal supply, you have a formal waste collection system that's really prioritizing landfilling. And one of the big issues there is that a lot of the waste that we generate is from small and medium sources. So 70% of the waste that we generate, especially in Chennai, comes from households, apartments. It's quite complicated to go down and collect such a disaggregated amount of data from so many sources. There's a World Bank study which says that for effective waste management in the global south, it can cost 20 to 50% of their available budget, just highlighting the issue, highlighting like that the waste collection system needs a rethink, and it's a little bit in crisis. And it's important to remember that municipal waste plastic is one of the feedstocks that is being mismanaged. And so we have similar issues when you talk about textile waste and e-waste and things like that. Waste collection really is the umbrella layer we should look at as how do we collect some of this material back. And yeah, a lot of material can technically go to the right. If it finds its way to the right destination, you can do something effective with it. Indian cities, about 50 to 60% of the municipal waste is organic. So technically, a lot of it can be composted. Again, when you look at the topic of waste of leakage of plastic, you could say that a lot of it is coming from the global south. This is just one study from the Ocean Conservancy, but you can say that, again, I want to tie this idea of improper waste collection systems in the global south that are quite centralized, quite ineffective, prioritize landfilling, and plastic waste being one of the mismanaged streams, and hence, there's a strong correlation between global south cities and plastic leakage. A second pillar, like that, I think is really important for us to, again, if the first pillar for our foundation is the issue of the cost of waste collection and how ineffective it is currently. The second one is the role of informality. When we talk about the informal sector being very active in the global south collecting plastic, for example, there's still a lot of misconceptions about who constitutes the informal sector. For example, a lot of people will still publicly communicate that there's only waste pickers who are informal workers. And I just want to say there's a lot of businesses that are informal also. This is a study from the ILO where they say more than 2 billion people work in the informal economy. Recycling, because again, our cities in the global south prioritize landfilling. There's so much value in that waste that's being sent. Since the 50s and 60s, we've had this thriving ecosystem of waste pickers, scrap shops set up to recover that waste and actually gain some commercial work out of it, make a livelihood out of that. So recycling is a typical place where you see a lot of informal work, and it doesn't consist just of waste because it's a broad one. A lot of supply chains, when you look more upstream, they consist of a lot of informal work, not just people, but also businesses, and in a lot of cases, infrastructure as well. So with those two kind of like let's say foundation stones set in, Kabadiwalla Connect, what we are really focused on is how do we really leverage this thriving informal recycling ecosystem that has been set up in the global south organically over so many decades to actually figure out how they can make money off the collection of certain types of material. How can we integrate them into the formal sector? Through that, how can we send less waste to the landfill? How can we also make sure that there's a strong health and safety component that we can add into the formalization? So formalization doesn't just have to mean giving them an ID card, but it can actually also mean better working conditions, more money, more compliance, attacking more of the compliance related concerns that everybody has in the informal sector. Very quickly, my entry point into waste management was these beach cleanups we used to do in Chennai. And what we did was we would clean these beaches, and then we realized that if we put it in the municipal bin, it was going to our landfills in Chennai. There's 2 landfills on marshlands, Palikarne and Kudangiyur. So it was, it generated a lot of questions of, are we just moving waste from one place to another? It was there that I saw waste pickers come in and pick up certain kinds of material. And I knew that they were going to their local scrap shop and selling it. But in the academic literature, when I was doing my master's, I felt that the aggregators were really underrepresented. And so that was when the idea of mapping the supply chain kind of really set in. This is something like 2015 or something like this. So what did I know about the informal sector from the research before wanting to map the entire system? I knew, from the research, there's a lot of waste pickers in India, over 1.5 million. In cities, there's a statistic that say they can collect up to 20% of the recyclable waste. That's a big number. That's millions of dollars worth of feedstock. And so for me, the aggregators are already playing a key role in the collection of this material and valorizing of this material. So this is something we want to look at. We also had studies that said for every ton the informal sector collects, the scrap shops and the waste pickers, there's a savings of around $300 per ton for the municipality. So really coming back to that core issue of waste collection and how costly it is in its current format. But then looking at more frontline workers, waste pickers making very little money, scavenging in extremely hazardous conditions, having to choose between health and safety and livelihood. So this is also a huge concern. One way that I like to tell people or show people this kind of myopic view they have when they look at the informal recycling supply chain and how it's set up is this visual right here. So I took the 30 most cited papers on the informal sector, and whenever there was a name that ascribed to a stakeholder in the supply chain, I mapped it. So the visual on the right, you can see it's a count of how many times a particular word was used to describe a stakeholder in the informal supply chain. So you can very quickly see that when people talk about informality, they mainly talk about collectors, waste pickers, waste ash pickers, and itinerant buyers. There is very little mention of aggregators. And when these aggregators are mentioned, it's quite confusing as to what they are. Are they middlemen? What is their role and what do they serve some positive function in the supply chain? That is really ambiguous right now in the research. So my goal, and we were lucky to win a couple of grants to do this. The biggest grant was with the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data, is financed by the World Bank, where we wanted to do the first ever census of the informal supply chain, which what that meant was sending people out into every administrative area in my hometown of Chennai, walk every street and map for the first time, geolocate the scrap shops and do a full assessment of what work they do and what kind of supply chain were we dealing with. I was looking at what materials they were picking up, what's the route to the processor, what's the relationships, what's the payment cycles, prices of materials, those kinds of things. And what we found here was critical was the waste picker. They formed, of course, really that first line, the level 0 of collection of material. But then equally critical were these other two stakeholders, these small scrap shops, level 1 aggregators. Again, they're so important that every local language actually has a word that describes them in their language. Like in India, in Hindi, they're called Kabadiwallas, these level 1 aggregators. In Indonesia, I think they're called lapaks. In Hong Kong, they're called corner recycling stores. And they really are a critical infrastructure of this informal supply chain when you come back to how they're able to collect so much volume, 20% or more. These are small shops. They're very retail oriented, about 100 to 200 square foot shops. They're material agnostic, which means they buy paper, plastic, glass, metal. They're they're interested if there's a right supply chain to collect new types of materials. And then they would then send it to these level 2s who are like seriously informal material recovery facilities. They have a high tension line. It's a warehouse, 5,000 square foot or more. There's a baler or a shredder. They're doing some critical pre-processing before sending it to a formal or informal processor. And in India, PET was already formalized before we started mapping. This map for me is really a proof in case of how the informal supply chain should be thought of not just as people, but also as infrastructure. Like what you see on a map on the left is every single level 1 aggregator we mapped. What's fascinating about these guys is that they just don't buy from waste pickers. Waste pickers form only about 30% of the volume that they are buying. The other 60, 70% is coming from the local community. There's this culture of small businesses, local houses, sending their recycled waste to this local scrap shop. In India and Chennai, they're called Kailan Kades. The level 2 aggregators are more clustered. They're more on access highways. They're more hidden, you could say. but they form also a critical part of the supply chain, of why the formal sector is able to collect material from a supply chain like this, because they're doing some baling, they're able to load this material onto big trucks, so on and so forth. In Chennai, our research showed that they were collecting 24% of what the city was generating, 130,000 tons. That's millions of dollars worth of feedstock. Plastic was not the dominant one. Paper and metal was really the starting point of the supply chain, why they really set up in the 50s and 60s. And plastic is a new game for them. PET is interesting, is especially a mature collection on PET, you can see in the Indian supply chain. Just to show you how powerful this ecosystem is, and we have a core hypothesis at Kabadiwalla Connect that a large recycler who sets up the right incentive ecosystem can divert large volumes away from the city, because look at PET. This is a visual, again, this was published with GIZ on Chennai, where we looked at the wards across our two major rivers. And when you looked at the level 1 aggregators within these wards, and you compared their volume collection for what was being generated, PET is almost at that 100% collection. So it just shows, and the reason why PET is so well defined is a thick material, there's value in it to move it a couple of places. It's part of a global textile supply chain at the moment, which is at least driving most of there is of course some demand from food grade PET, but in India, a lot of it is PET to textile. So like, closed open loop system. But yeah, it's extremely well collected. And we see no reason why this can't be the case for rigids like PP and PE. In India, if you look at it, there have been now investments into good processing systems that's going to create a lot of demand for PP and PE. Where we still have a lot of issues is the thinner plastics, because there's extra subsidies involved there. And yeah, it's how to figure out the finances of it, really. That I would say that the collection mechanism, the recycling infrastructure, or the technologies are there. It's who pays for it, I think, is a foundational concern. So yeah, moving on. So KC, what we do, we offer solutions in these layers, as you can see on the screen. So the core of the work we do is to unravel these supply chains and create accurate baselines for people. They either have a big interest from a policy-making perspective, or actually from the first investment decision of a recycling plant. This is, again, they require key data on what's happening in their supply chain of interest. On top of this data, we are able to also offer informal sector-friendly traceability solutions. So again, when you think of the informal sector, they're collecting 130,000 tons. All of this is following a general ledger system. They have bills, they have weighing scales, a mass balance general ledger system that they have built and they have been following, and they have their own taxonomy of how they account for things. So when you talk about digitalization, it's really not just accounting for the digitalization, but it's also accounting for their processes and what would work for them and their name nomenclatures and things like that. That's what would make it informal sector friendly. We do procurement guarantees in India. Our big mission is to try to secure a long-term offtake agreement for certain kinds of materials that allow us to invest and retrofit these type of informal supply chains from a health and safety perspective. And then we're doing a lot of experiments around collection. How can you actually utilize this supply chain to pull a lot more waste, recyclable waste, and potentially other types of waste into proper channels? How do you channelize? How do you use the system to channelize waste more effectively? At the heart of the system that we've unpacked, it's decentralized, it's hyper efficient. It's a lot of people with knowledge involved. So especially when you look at, I think the informal supply chain, especially waste pickers and level 1 aggregators, they have a lot to offer for collection and feedstock channelization. Initially, we were grant funded to do the data collection, but more and more, we find ourselves part of some really exciting networks and part of some exciting commercial pilots. The Niti Aayog network has been, we're part of the expert committee on circular economy, so it's a great platform, again, to speak of expanding the understanding of the informal supply chain in recycling and what can it offer us when we really think about innovating for improved circular economy outcomes in a country like India and the global south. And we're really tailored for the global south. We have a lot of experience in trying to integrate these systems. I'm just going to now share like a few examples from different projects. But maybe the last point here before I open up maybe a few questions is, again, like, what is our thought process behind an integration pathway? The first key step is enumeration, really understanding these material baselines and taking them seriously. Like, how much do they collect of what? What do the system look like? What's the payment cycles, et cetera, et cetera. And then integrating a lot of the stakeholders into social protection packages that are locally available. In a lot of cases, waste pickers especially haven't been integrated at the last mile at all. In India, for example, we found that waste pickers don't have Aadhaar cards and were completely missed from that cycle of Aadhaar card edition. So, we step in to take it to take up that kind of role. The third is traceable procurement, but again, keeping in mind how things work and how you build something that's inclusive and holistic, again, to meet people's commercial ambitions. And then the fourth is on dignified collection. We see here, if you can actually divert the waste picker from scavenging into the household and create more connections between communities and the local scrap shop and their waste pickers, then there's so many opportunities for building dignified collection models. I just want to emphasize here that the scrap shop, their main feedstock is not what we see. And again, this is from diverse experience. It's not just the feedstock from waste, because that's important, but it's 30 to 40%. The other 50, 60 is coming from people in that local neighborhood knowing of that scrap shop and going and selling material. So in some way, the transactions that the scrap shop is doing with the local community represents this kind of invisible deposit return scheme that the Global South has kind of created. I've had discussions where, when you look at the incentives of deposit return schemes, Western versus here, how much they actually pay for certain types of plastic, it's a big divide, and so it just shows that in some way this is like more market exposure, and it's a very fascinating type of system that's happening. So completely invisible, but representing large volumes, a lot of transactions happen. I'm just going to stop here to field a few questions if there's anything. Anna, if you don't mind helping field one or two questions, I'm happy to take it, or else I can continue, no issues.
Yeah, none so far. Go ahead, continue.
All right, sounds great. Cool. So moving to a few case studies, just want to talk about the Chennai data set being used. Again, we were very proud of this, being able to work with the Tamil Nadu Pollution Control Board to start defining these stakeholders by this kind of granular data collection. And again, what we see, it's amazing to see how these reports then are used by policymakers to articulate a more nuanced understanding of the supply chain. So being able to say, hey, now we know that there are, let's say 100 scrap shops in zone 13, and the Ministry of Environment, the secretary, saying, okay, now how do we get them to collect e-waste? And it really sets up a more nuanced ability to talk about collection. And so we see that similar with GIZ. This was published along with the Tamil Nadu Ministry of Environment and Forest and Climate Change. But also in the private sector, in Indonesia, we did this kind of baseline assessment for a new plant that Veolia was setting up there, a food grade to food grade PET plant. And again, the data helped, of course, understand and support the first investment decision, and how, do you need a label peeler? Will they do it? What's the, there's a lot of things you can see. But also it helped define what an inclusive supply chain could mean, beyond just waste pickers. So for example, when working with the study really supported the language behind working with the entire supply chain, acknowledging these tiers of aggregation that's happening and the importance of these tiers of aggregation for the recycler to secure quality and volume based feedstock. Moving on to traceability, again, mass balance, I think, is the fundamental principle that defines a very positive traceability system. This is also the foundation of the informal traceability system that exists today through general ledgers and weighing scales. Waste pickers pick up material, go to the scrap shop, get it weighed. There is a transaction, there is data capture on the volumes and prices, moving along all the way up to the recycler. And just to give some examples of how do you incorporate like a really high level of digitalization given the informal sector. I want to just talk about the Indonesia example a bit further. So again, we did some mapping in Semarang. You see the same idea, level ones and level twos, lot more clustered away, you could say, than the India case, but still serving that core function. We saw a lot of waste pickers on motorized vehicles, for example, unlike in Chennai, where there's a lot more walking. But doing the same function, L1's material agnostic, buying paper, plastic, glass, metal, the L2s being more specialized. So there are PET specific balers and things like that. So with Veolia, there was a baler we identified in Semarang, Indonesia, where, again, when you look at his taxonomy and the standard taxonomy, there was a difference there, which we first mapped. And again, this is part of the building the baseline case. What do they call something? And not messing with that system too much, because it's, you want the outcome. You don't want to really change their nomenclature. It's quite a tedious task. Going into their, basically going into this level 2 site, understanding the different processes that were happening. There were processes happening. There's a clear path in all of these places, even though it looks quite chaotic. There's a place where pre-storage happens. There's a place where the final bales are laid across. There's a lot of different elements that you account for in that process flow. And then essentially following the principles of mass balance, develop a traceability system that accounts for authorization, that accounts for volume loss, and can map it back to actors and things like that. So I'm just going to show you a video of the final integration there, just to give you a sense. Yeah, again, here, just want to say the part that we found that had the most viability of uptake was very simple systems. In this case, what we did was build a point of sale device that can account for data capture and then link that to a Bluetooth weighing scale. So it's actually just a sensor that we added to their scale. And what this allows us to do is just prove to the client that, it's the weighments are not being able to, you can't really gamify it at that level, you can track it. So if there were deviations, you could ascribe it more to bad actors in the tier 2 side. So the smaller scrap shops selling to this baler in case. And there's a lot of small stuff like that. People put water in bottles to inflate prices, inflate the weight, or put small metal objects. So this system really captures at the individual vendor level to this baler the material quality. And so you're able to actually go bale by bale and build the provenance of where it's come from, and really build the case for its post-consumer. It involves these various actors, things like that. So in this case, again, simple idea of like printing a QR code at the site and then like slapping it onto each bale, then a simple app at the recycler level where the provenance data was there. You could use that to then channelize your bales, red channel, green channels, things like that. We have now, this project was from a few years ago, but we have now a very interesting project in Hong Kong that's all based on traceability as well. That, again, the Indonesia and India case forms the backbone of how we are approaching that project as well. And it's, again, it's still ongoing, but it's yielding very, very successful results. In this case, in Hong Kong, of all places, we were called to examine the informal recycling supply chain there. Lo and behold, level 1s and level 2s existed, just like India, just like Indonesia, forming a key part of the collections, of the recycled waste collection system there in the recycling ecosystem. A very fascinating thing about Hong Kong right now is that they don't collect PET bottles because the incentives haven't been set. And so you're actually at a place where the infrastructure is there, doing paper and metal in a serious way. And there's a fantastic opportunity for integration of this ecosystem with a lot of compliance elements, health and safety elements for the recovery of PET. Cleaners and waste pickers in Hong Kong are a key part of the system, using these kind of trolleys to go around picking up material. small corner recycling shops, Kabadiwalla, Lanka, Lapaks, you can name it what you like. They're a big part of the system, have a local, like they have a local connection there. It's a strong cultural, it's something that you see there and you expect to see as a Hong Kong local. And then you have bailing sites, equally precarious, doing, with high tension lines, doing large volumes, but plastics, not so much right now. So it's really very fascinating. Lots of corner recycling shops feeding the neighborhood. So this idea that they set up to serve the community sticks in Hong Kong as well. Level 2 aggregators, again, forming a key part of the supply chain in terms of the valorization element or the pre-processing element. And yeah, it's a more complex project here because we're looking at tier 1 and tier 2 elements. So again, source to the recycler. And we're able to account for mass balance in a very interesting way. Again, keeping in mind how people work and how the supply chain functions, and keeping that baseline as a really important starting point for us. Moving back to India, just in terms of procurement, I just want to give you a feel of how you partner with the informal sector, or how we decided to partner with the informal sector to meet like a procurement volume demand from a recycler, funded through a brand. The first is we signed an MOU with a level 2 aggregator. So this is an informal MRF. We didn't set up our own MRF. We went into this particular MRF that was already set up, signed an MOU, and worked within his local ecosystem to find potential suppliers of these bottles. Again, approach it quite methodically in terms of pricing and what's the best price to value. And then, these delivery notes are sent across that essentially allows you to, again, there's a system here for your EPR compliance that we were able to easily manage through this kind of process, keeping, of course, mass balance at the heart of it. So the other interesting thing about this particular project was the focus on compliance. And again, here, I think there's a really interesting learning for us working with this. So we were, again, I probably should just mention that, we are being incubated through Shell Game Changer. And so Shell, they have this internal protocol called the IOGP framework. It's not just theirs, but it's the oil and gas producers protocol. And so they gave us, as part of Shell Game Changer, a mandate to look at this protocol and what would that mean for level 2 aggregators and level 1 aggregators. It's the first time we were able to define health and safety compliance in a very structured way that could be digested by such a large company. And what we're learning is these other large companies have similar kinds of protocols. So really working with a compliance protocol in mind, and then looking at how that impacts this particular infrastructure and site and labor compliance is a very, very promising way of approaching and retrofitting the supply chain. I just want to share a video of some work that we did partnering with a local architecture firm. So yeah, I'll just share that.
So there's no audio. We can't hear what the interview is saying.
Hi, folks. Okay, I'm just going to continue. Let me just maybe. Okay. So I won't get into the details too much, but again, this visual is important to me because you're able to translate these life-saving rules and really study the ecosystem in terms of what is required. And again, there are many standards, there are many systems, but really with using a strong baseline to then articulate these standards, I think can lead to a lot of very, very positive outcomes. maybe the last point before I stop, I'm aware that I'm out of time, is the power of collection, and at the lowest level, at the first line, between waste generators and this their demand to actually do something with their waste. Again, we found about 2,000 scrap shops in Chennai. A further study shows that there was about 600 who were ready to actually be a part of a pop-up culture, who were said on a Saturday, I'm happy to, leave my shop and come out into, let's say, an association or a neighborhood and do a pop-up scrap shop collection drive. And so just showing that they're very, very interested in partnering with us to first increase volumes that come to their store, but by actually doing unique things about it. And so, KC, we have this test where we launched an app where people can find these types of Kabadiwallas. They also use specific types of bill books so that we have more structured data on who's selling what. And essentially on the community side, you get them to focus on segregation activities and awareness, get them to find their local scrap shop, but also bring the scrap shop into a larger community, and it facilitates a lot of volume collection. And so we've been piloting this kind of thing where scrap shops have been coming out of their shop and coming into apartments, where residents have been using our app to find the local scrap shop and sell. And again, a more structured bill basically to show the traceability or the data in terms of volume. And this is where this idea of, is this a deposit return scheme that is invisible in my mind comes through, which I guess requires further articulation. I won't go into the videos, but again, there's just a lot of positivity here. Like, people are passionate about this project because it solves this pain that they have of sending material to the landfill or the formal sector collecting it and throwing it out, things like that. So it's a very sticky, we believe, very sticky, very exciting process. You could do the same thing with beach cleanups. You can partner with the local scrap shop and bring them into the project and get some of the material back into recycling, not just all to the landfill. You can also scale these projects. We have an amazing partnership with Lanka Environmental Fund and the SPM Foundation in Batiklo, where we're essentially doing the same kind of thing there. Maybe I can end here, which is just like a pop-up we did in a school in Batiklo that SPM ran. And has been developing there, where again the person comes with his weighing scale, write the bills, the students are lining up to sell material, and this is a very spreadable campaign. Every scrap shop, if you talk to them in a particular way, could be a part of this. So I'll stop there. Sorry for taking more time, but happy to field any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sid. Let's give him a virtual round of applause. Thank you so much for that informative and inspiring presentation. I love how you started by saying that we don't really know how to define, or there's confusion on how to define the informal sector, because it's not just the waste pickers, right? It's bigger than that. I wanted to let you know, maybe you weren't able to catch it, but we have a wide range of participants coming from different parts of the waste sector. There's people working in biomass conversion and utilization, supply chains, industrial trading, wastewater, and solid waste. So we have a very interesting composition of participants, almost 90 participants today joining the webinar. So there's a lot of interest in this topic. There's also a comment that maybe you can respond to. It says, most of the time, local Kabadiwallas don't collect MLP, so multi-layer plastics and low-value plastics, and that's a huge problem. So this is from Shruti Gose. Maybe you can comment on that.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, at the heart of this system, people make money off it and they look at it purely as a livelihood addition. They are not providing a municipal service. So low value plastic, I think I mentioned it also when I was speaking about in terms of ecosystem collection, doesn't happen at scale because somebody has to subsidize it. It's not like PET where there's money to be made on top, but it requires subsidies. It comes from this point of waste collection also is, it's a public effort. It's not really commercial. And so it requires a certain way of thinking about that. Low value plastic, great example, just the incentives on.
Yeah, it's still hard to create value for multi-layer plastics. And essentially, if there's no value, then it's not going to be collected. Jitendra has a hand up. You can unmute yourself.
Yeah, hi Sid. Very nice presentation. I must congratulate you. This was very, very eye-opening also. There's so many things you're doing. My question is, I'm coming directly to the point. I was curious, in your study area, what do you see the perspective of collecting this recyclable waste from the people who are living in high-rise apartments? In the examples you talked about, you said that almost 30% is coming from the rack pickers, waste pickers, but otherwise people are directly selling to the Kabadiwalla or whatever. But I find that when I was living in a small house, it was possible to reach because they were coming and asking for that. But if I'm in a high-rise apartment, I'm just throwing everything all together and that is going to landfill. So in your study area, what was your experience and how do you see this challenge?
Yeah, definitely. I think this is where the pop-up culture is a big point here. So we've had a lot of success piloting in apartments, 100 people, 200 people living apartments, where the scrap shop brings his tricycle and sets up shop for 2 to 3 hours at the apartment. And then the staff or even sometimes the resident themselves comes and sells it. So it's more of a like I think one way to solve that issue, because you're right, like it does create this disconnect. Like most of the volume that's going to the scrap shop is from the mom and pop store, the kirana store, where that's the volume. But apartments are disconnected at this point, and one way to solve it is to get the scrap shop more visibility. So use technology so that some
Yes,
concerned citizen can find the local scrap shop, but then also get them inside so that they can collect the volume dynamically.
thank you.
Thank you so much for that question. It's also like an out of sight, out of mind situation when you live in a high rise building. You throw it in a chute and then you don't see it anymore. So it's like magic, it just disappears. But actually, a lot of it ends up in the landfill because it's not segregated.
Yeah,
There's
Hong Kong. Just want to add to that. So Hong Kong is a great example. We've never seen high rises like that, and what they have is refuse collection points. But there's this cleaner army that's on contract with the welfare with the association that is looking to make money off this recycled waste, and then creates these patterns where they work independently or individually with different households. And there are multiple cleaners who have these relationships inside these apartments that then bring the recycled waste to the refuse collection center. So
yeah,
yeah, it's
definitely. Okay, so there's another question here from Trin Taiha. Thank you, Mr. Sid, for your comprehensive sharing. I'm Ha from Resonance Global, currently supporting research focusing on inclusive regulatory framework and business practice in e-waste management and recycling in ASEAN. Particularly interested in the accessibility of the digital solutions you introduced. From your experience, are these digital tools and technologies accessible by women and people with disability, including in the informal sector? Which good practices do you recommend to assist businesses, including those owned by women and people with disability, to equally benefit from accessing and utilizing tools and technologies? This is a fantastic question.
great question. Um, yeah, I think the best way to answer the starting point for us was the adoption we saw with the mobile phone.
Mm.
And when you look at the data, and again, it replicates, I think, across, is that waste pickers are in the ultra poor category. And if they have a phone, they have a feature phone, and adoption in terms of traceability or data input from waste pickers is quite limited. What we found was the scrap shop was the key mediator in digitalization in this case. So the scrap shop was much more dynamic, already had a phone, already had Google Pay, for example, and knows what a point of sale device is. And so
Mm.
if you set up a system where there's a third party enrollment system, where you're able to enroll the waste pickers, help them get an Aadhaar card, help them get a health insurance scheme that's localized, but then work with the scrap shop for the data collection. What is this waste picker bringing to the shop, and what is the weighment data showing? That's when you see the positive inputs, because the system is capturing the people and how we're supporting the people, especially waste pickers. It's capturing volume data, but it's not putting the heavy lifting on the waste picker stakeholder group for the input of that data.
Mhm.
And so, so I think, again, that's why the scrap shop is such a key negotiator in all of this, and it's so underrepresented. Like a lot of folks in the formal sector talk about waste pickers as being dependent on only plastic. It's as though that the only reason they are making money is because of plastic. It's not true. It's paper and metal. That's the foundation of the supply chain. And that's also the foundation between the scrap shop and the waste picker. You know, waste pickers are a prize commodity in the supply chain. If you have waste pickers working with your scrap shop, they make a little bit more money. And so there's a lot of stickiness and positive relationships. There's a lot of tough stuff also. You could argue in some cases, where is indentured labor, where is it not? But by and large, what we've seen is that you know, there's a strong relationship between scrap shops and waste pickers. COVID, great example. Scrap shops didn't want to lose their waste pickers, and so gave them money, found them places to stay, probably already helped them with places to stay, said, go and pick up waste, leave it outside my door, I'll pay you later. Like, so incentivized to give them a daily stipend so that they would hang around for their business when it opened up again. And just that's where fundamentally underrepresented or under-analyzed stickiness component between the aggregator and the waste picker. It's always assumed that it's a bad relationship. And it's much more complicated and nuanced than that.
Yeah, I in your talk earlier, you used the word complicated, and I think like it's such a good description of how this entire ecosystem is. It's like it's not black and white, right? There's so many complicated relationships and finance components to it. There is a follow-up question from Violet of Resource Futures, all the way from Bristol in the UK. You showed a video with a digital tracking app in Indonesia. Can you elaborate on any risks with using this system? For example, improper use either by mistake or fraud, and any mitigation you considered. So maybe like, how can you validate the information that's input there? Can people like hack it? Is it easy to break into it?
I mean, there are again, maybe this is more a question to my CTO, but there are, as I understand, key systems that you use to protect it against outside attack. But internally, what we're most concerned about is the system accounting for mass balance. So and the authorization. So we focus a lot on getting the signatures, enrolling the right people so that everything is happening within a fairly stochastic system. Yeah, but we do get consigned because it's such a dynamic industry. You do get a lot of data that you have to pass, which is what is an acceptable volume loss. Is there a volume loss amongst a vendor that is consistent, and then can that be audited and found that there's some additional water or whatever? But at a very broad level, yeah, what the system helps you understand is, has everything that has been sent to a recycler been accounted for bale by bale? And even if that data is uncertain, you have an important data point, which is that something wrong happened. And because so many consignments happen, this is where you use the data to build a profile on what's happening into the system. Again, being a continuous process business. So yeah, the heart of the system looks internally for, can you balance the books on every bale that's being sent to the recycler? And if so, who is the vendor that could be responsible, or what is the particular consignment that was responsible for this deviation?
Yeah. And if you collect data consistently enough, you'll start seeing patterns. So if there's a data input that is so off, then it could lead you to ask questions like, what is going on with this month or this area, for example?
Yeah, look, in this case, that's why the Bluetooth sensor in the weighing scale was so important, because you can't gamify that data point. It's not somebody reading the weighing scale, it's the input direct. But then you can still tip the weighing scale a little bit. Like, you can make it. So that was at that level, you can check at that. Again, the deviations can show you that maybe somebody's playing with the weighing scale, but the system, because that's why I think that Bluetooth connection on the weight from the weighing scale is so important, because it builds that credibility that these are authorized weighing scales being used and that data is being hard-coded into the point of sale device.
Okay, so we have about 10 minutes left, and I want to share a comment and then last two questions. One comment from Upasna Kapoor. We work with the RWA to have housekeeping and house collectors to collect all kabadi from residents and save it in one location where our Kabadiwalla comes and collects it a couple of times a week. So that's one comment. And then a couple of the last two questions. From Pok Pong, from your experience, how significant is the issue of cross-contamination between food contact and non-food contact plastics in the plastic waste stream? And what strategies or solutions have you seen that effectively manage this challenge? Well, this is an interesting question because it is a big concern. And then the last question is from Sahib. Hi, Sid. Thank you very much for your insightful presentations. They've been working on formalizing the waste sector in Pakistan. How do you manage taxation costs, considering that many stakeholders in downstream supply chains, from waste pickers to recyclers, are hesitant to adopt digital system and prefer to operate through informal transactions like via cash rather than bank transfer?
Yeah, all great questions. I think to address the first one, I think that's a great example of a very global South innovation to spur more collection, right? And I see there's a lot of power and positivity in this. I just want to come back to this point that, like, it's still so underutilized, the power of the scrap shop. We have all of these points with the waste picker, but if we looked at the waste picker and scrap shop as a unit, then you can expand the framework of what is possible for innovation. Send a waste picker to a local household to pick up material and come back to the scrap shop and collect data, or send the scrap shop straight into the, do these pop-ups and or use a mobile app to help people connect more. So I think this is honestly something that if we get right and if we're able to scale, it's something that is going to be unique, but there are certain foundational elements. It's leveraging a decentralized collection system. That's what these scrap shops and waste pickers represent. And I think that's fundamentally could be a different approach that the global South takes, because you have these systems. If we accurately go out and baseline them and build the right incentives and like have these like sandboxes where we learn from each other, then you can really, India does 200,000 cleanups every year. If every cleanup had a scrap shop, you're talking about another 20,000 tons into the ecosystem, So the cool thing is how this scales, because there's so many scrap shops and they have all these aligned values with regards to making money off collection. Yeah, so in terms of the adoption, you have to play it really smartly. And this is why the starting point should be, we should assume that they're smart people making money. Scrap shops make money, and that's how they're able to pay their rent. And the way they do this is by having a general ledger system that they know what's in, what's coming in, what's going out, and who their best performers are, and all of that. And they behave appropriately. So when you look at a digitalization system that does that, like even if it's just a paper system, and you digitalize it, it could be a very low-tech thing, but it needs to build on a real practice, which is that millions of dollars worth of transactions are happening through the supply chain. And you have to account for that first in your traceability system. So I think that's an important starting point when you think of the local context. And you have to think of the local context, low tech in some cases, high tech, but easily accessible in other cases. But I think the foundation is they have figured something out already. And you're not coming in to teach them something. You're rather figuring out how can you piggyback on their on their transaction system. That's going to get you good outputs. Yeah, contamination, big problem, especially considering waste pickers are scavenging. So it's a acute risk that they face every time they go out and scavenge. Also, contamination affects the price and whether the scrap shop will take it or not. Because it does matter as you go further up in the baling process. And so this is a big issue with marine plastics, like ocean plastic. I mean, if you take stuff out from the river or you take stuff out, beach is also still okay. I mean, you can find stuff that the scrap shop will buy, nylon fishing nets, for example, the scrap shops will buy. But yeah, when it comes to ocean plastic and when you scoop out stuff from there, it's very contaminated. Yeah, it's very contaminated, but also, it's really important to get people, because there's this huge food culture, plastic culture with last mile delivery. It would be amazing if every community member washed it out before they sold it to the Kabadiwalla. And so that could have a massive change in terms of the contact issues that you face.
Great, thank you. So all the questions have been answered. Thank you so much, Sid. This was a very insightful and very well-attended webinar. So there seems to be a lot of interest in how we can bridge the gap between the informal and formal sectors and do it in a way that is inclusive and that takes into account the welfare of our informal waste sector. So you have you have a lot of fans, I think, in this group. And for those who are watching, we invite you to the Circular Economy Forum happening in the ADB headquarters June 17 and 18, so we can hear more stories about this. And we are going to be tackling the informal waste sector and how we can address this in the waste value chain as well. So we hope to see you there. Registration is free, and it'll be in the headquarters in Manila. So again, thank you, Sid. And for those attending, please make sure to answer the post-event survey that will pop up in your screen once you leave this room. Thank you, everyone. And for more updates on circular economy, please follow us on Twitter or x.com/adb environment. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. See you.